The sky had been brooding all afternoon, a restless gray that felt like it had been holding its breath for hours. Clouds rolled and thickened low, blotting out the sun, until the whole city seemed caught under a muted, waiting spell. People hurried along the sidewalks, glancing up uneasily as if they knew what was coming. I had been among them, walking with my collar turned up and my hands deep in my pockets, half hoping the rain would hold off until I made it home. It didn't. The first drop hit my cheek like a cool whisper, followed by another, then another. Within seconds, the sky gave in completely, spilling sheets of rain that sent pedestrians scattering for shelter. I ducked into the first refuge I could find, a small tea cafe tucked at the corner of an old cobblestone street. The wooden sign above the door, its paint faded from years of weather, swung and creaked in the wind. The moment I stepped inside, the storm was replaced by a world of warmth. The door closed behind me with a soft chime, and I was immediately wrapped in the scent of brewing tea and something faintly sweet, freshly baked pastries, maybe. The air was warmer than outside, thick with the sound of quiet chatter and the occasional clink of porcelain cups against saucers. It was the kind of cafe that felt untouched by time. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars of tea leaves labeled in neat handwriting. A counter toward the back displayed an assortment of biscuits and cakes, each under its own glass dome. The light was soft golden, and it seemed to smooth the edges of everything it touched. And then I saw her. She was sitting by the window, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, her gaze fixed on the rain outside. The glass in front of her was streaked with rivulets of water, and I could see the faint reflection of her face layered over the blurred street beyond. Her hair framed her face in loose waves, a few strands catching the glow of the lamp above her table. She wasn't just watching the rain, she was lost in it, as if the world beyond the glass held a story only she could read. Raindrops slid down in crooked races, merging and breaking apart before vanishing into the sill, and she followed them with the kind of quiet focus that made the rest of the cafe fade away. I stood there for a moment, pretending to glance over the menu chalked on the wall, but really, I was trying not to stare. There was nothing flashy about her, no bold colors or loud gestures. It was her stillness that caught me. In a room full of movement, she seemed anchored, unhurried. I ordered a cup of Assam and chose a seat a few tables away, close enough that I could see her without being obvious. The chair creaked softly as I sat, and I tried to lose myself in the steam curling up from my cup. But my eyes kept drifting back to the window, to the way she would occasionally lift her cup and take a slow sip, her fingers curled neatly around the porcelain. Something about her presence felt familiar, not in a way that made me think I'd met her before, but in the way a melody can feel familiar even if you've never heard it. Like she belonged to a part of my life I hadn't lived yet. Outside, the rain continued to fall in a steady rhythm, the street glistening under the muted glow of the lamps. Inside, I sat in the warmth of the cafe, my tea cooling as I found myself memorizing the small details, the curve of her hand around the cup, the way her eyes softened when she looked at the rain, the quiet air she carried as if she had nowhere else to be. And somewhere between the creak of the wooden sign outside and the steady patter against the glass, I realized I wasn't in any hurry to leave. It happened so quickly that I almost thought I'd imagined it. Our eyes met, just for a moment, but it was long enough for me to feel a quiet jolt, like a single note struck in the middle of silence. Her gaze wasn't piercing or demanding. It was calm, almost curious, as if she was acknowledging my presence without breaking the peaceful bubble she seemed to live in. And then she smiled. Not a wide grin, not something meant to invite conversation, just a small, polite curve of the lips. The kind of smile you give a stranger when you catch each other's eyes by accident. It should have meant nothing, but it felt like something. Before I could think of what to do with that moment, she turned back to her tea, her attention drifting once again to the rain outside. I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding, then stepped up to the counter and ordered my own tea. Assam again. I didn't want to risk distraction by deciding on something new. I chose a seat to tables away from hers, close enough to observe without being intrusive. My chair scraped softly against the wooden floor, but she didn't look my way again. She was too absorbed in the window, the soft steam from her cup curling upward, fogging the glass just slightly before disappearing. I pulled a book from my bag, one I'd been meaning to finish for weeks, and set it open on the table. But my eyes barely touched the page. I kept stealing glances in her direction, trying to be discreet, as though the act of watching her might somehow explain why she had caught my attention so completely. there was something about the way she watched the rain. It wasn't idle. She wasn't just passing time until the storm let up. She was engaged with it, connected to it, like each drop carried a memory, and the sky was letting them fall just for her. The expression on her face was soft, thoughtful, with a trace of nostalgia that made me wonder what story she was reliving in her mind. Occasionally, she would shift in her seat, crossing her legs or tucking her hair behind her ear. Once, she glanced at her phone, then set it back down without unlocking it, almost as if it had interrupted something important. Around us, the calf hummed with life-low conversations, the gentle clink of cups, the hiss of steam from the espresso machine, but it all seemed to fade into the background. The world outside the window was a blur of silver and gray, streaked with water and lit by the muted glow of the street lamps. Inside, her presence seemed to anchor the space, as if the rain and the calf existed solely to frame her in that moment. I took slow sips of my tea, letting the warmth spread through my hands. It was a quiet sort of comfort, the kind that made you want to stay still and simply exist in a place without rushing through it. I tried to imagine what it might be like to start a conversation with her. What would I even say? Do you always watch the rain like that? What's on your mind? All of it felt too forward, too revealing for two strangers separated by only a few tables and a fragile sort of silence. Still, I found myself ridiculously hoping that she might look over again. Just one more glance, one more smile, something to tell me that the pull I felt wasn't entirely one-sided. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she reached for her tea again, lifting the cup with both hands, her fingers wrapping around it like she was holding something delicate. She took a sip, closed her eyes for the briefest moment, and then opened them again to watch the raindrops race each other down the glass. And sitting there, pretending to read, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rain was telling her secrets, and I was desperate to know what they were. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the windows in a steady, insistent rhythm. The sound filled the space between conversations, blending with the low hum of voices and the clatter of cups. The calf, once comfortably busy, now brimmed with people shaking off umbrellas and searching for somewhere to sit. The air felt warmer, more alive, carrying the mingled scents of steeping tea, coffee, and freshly baked bread. I was halfway through my cup when the waiter approached, weaving between tables with a tray balanced in one hand. He stopped beside me, a polite but slightly rushed expression on his face. "Would you mind sharing your table? We're full," he asked, already glancing toward the door as though expecting more customers to push in at any moment. I followed his gaze, and there she was. She stood a few feet away, her cup in one hand, her other resting lightly on the strap of her bag. A strand of hair had slipped loose from behind her ear, damp from the short dash she must have made from the window to the counter. Her eyes met mine briefly, not with that polite distance from earlier, but with something softer, almost hesitant. "Please," I said, quickly moving my bag from the chair opposite me. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She smiled in acknowledgement and set her cup down before slipping into the seat. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No cinematic music played in the background. And yet, something shifted. Her presence across from me was different than watching her from 2 tables away. The space between us now was filled with the small details I hadn't noticed before: the faint steam curling from her tea, the way her fingers wrapped neatly around the cup, the scent of rain still clinging faintly to her scarf. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm and warm, carrying just enough weight to be heard over the rain and the chatter. "Of course," I replied, resisting the urge to add, "I've been hoping for this all afternoon." For a few moments, we simply drank our tea in companionable silence. It wasn't awkward, not exactly, but there was an awareness in the air, as if both of us knew that a choice was about to be made: speak or retreat into the safety of silence. I glanced at the book still lying open beside me. "Good day for reading," I offered, tapping the page lightly. She followed my gesture, her eyes flicking to the cover. "It is," she said, "though I admit I've been too distracted to open mine." She gave the faintest smile, and I couldn't help wondering if she meant the rain, or something else. "The rain has that effect," I said, watching her reaction. She nodded, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window. "It's like the world slows down," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Everything feels softer, even the things you didn't notice before." It was such a simple observation, but it landed with me. That was exactly what this felt like: slowed, softened, distilled down to just this table, this moment, this stranger. We talked more after that, nothing too personal, just small threads of conversation about the weather, the calf, the kinds of tea we liked. She mentioned she came here sometimes to watch the rain, and I told her I'd stumbled in by accident. I suppose it's a good place to get caught, she said, and there was something in her tone that made me wonder if she meant more than just the weather. As the minutes passed, the noise of the calf seemed to blur into the background. The rain outside had no intention of letting up, and I realized I was perfectly fine with that. The warmth in my hands from the tea was pleasant, but it was nothing compared to the quiet warmth that came from her being there, sitting across from me. When she lifted her cup again, I noticed the way her eyes met mine over the rim just for a second, but enough to make me feel as though the space between us had grown smaller, and that's when it struck me. Sometimes the rain doesn't just keep you indoors. Sometimes it brings someone to your table. At first, our words tiptoed around safe topics, the kind you use to fill the space between strangers. The weather, the smell of the tea, the charm of an old calf tucked into the corner of a winding street. But somewhere between one sip and the next, the conversation shifted, almost without me noticing. She told me about her love for old books, not just reading them, but the way they smelled, the way the pages felt under her fingers. It's like holding a piece of someone else's time, she said, her eyes drifting toward the rain-streaked window. There's something comforting in knowing a story has already been loved by someone before you. I told her about my habit of walking in the rain, even when I didn't need to. It feels like the world belongs to fewer people when it rains, I said. The streets are emptier, and you can hear your own thoughts. She tilted her head slightly, considering that. Or maybe, she said softly, you hear other thoughts more clearly, the ones you've been avoiding. It was the kind of comment that stayed with me, even as we moved on to other topics. She spoke with a quiet thoughtfulness, like each word had been tested for truth before it left her mouth. Our conversation began to weave in unexpected directions. I learned she had once dreamed of working in a library, but now worked in design. She learned that I collected old postcards, not because of the pictures, but because of the messages people had scrawled on the back. It's like reading a tiny slice of someone's life, I explained. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're heartbreaking, but they all feel real. She smiled at that, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. You like things that carry a history, she said, almost as if she was piecing something together about me. And you, I replied, like things that hold stories. That made her laugh, and the sound was soft but warm, like the very first hint of sunlight breaking through clouds. The kind of laugh that didn't demand attention but somehow made the whole room feel lighter. I noticed too, the way her eyes lit up when she found something amusing. Not just the quick flash of humor, but a deeper brightness, as though she was letting you see a part of her you wouldn't get from small talk alone. Somewhere outside, the rain softened, but I didn't notice until much later. The storm had become background music to our conversation, the rhythm of the drops matching the rhythm of our words. Time stretched in that pleasant, slippery way it does when you're fully caught in a moment, unaware of how quickly it's moving past you. We talked about small things, her favorite tea, my inability to bake anything edible, but also about quiet, personal things. She told me she sometimes went days without speaking to anyone, by choice, just to see what silence felt like. I admitted that I sometimes walked home the long way, not because I had to, but because it gave me a chance to notice the things I usually overlooked. It wasn't until she laughed at one of my truly bad jokes, a groaner about tea leaves predicting the weather, that I realized how much I wanted to make her laugh again. There was something addictive about it, like the first sip of a drink you didn't know you'd been craving. I glanced outside. The rain had slowed to a delicate drizzle, the kind that doesn't hurry people along but invites them to linger. Inside, the calf felt warmer than before, not because of the tea or the lamps, but because of her presence across the table. By the time our cups were empty, it felt less like talking to a stranger and more like remembering an old friend. I didn't want the conversation to end, and judging by the way she lingered over the last drop in her cup, neither did she. The rain might have been easing, but neither of us made a move to leave. If someone had asked me how long we'd been sitting there, I wouldn't have been able to answer. Time had melted into something soft and shapeless, stretching and folding in on itself until minutes and hours were indistinguishable. All I knew was that the rain outside had gone from a steady downpour to a quiet patter, and the tea in my cup had long since cooled, but neither of us seemed to care. The rain had become our soundtrack, a constant, soothing murmur that seemed to sync with the pace of our conversation. Every now and then, a distant roll of thunder would ripple through the air, and she would pause, almost listening for something hidden in the sound. The clinking of cups and the soft shuffle of feet from the calf staff filled in the spaces between our words, like the quiet percussion of an unplanned symphony. And then there was the lightning. It wasn't frequent, just an occasional flash that streaked across the clouds, spilling pale silver light through the rain-slicked windows. When it happened, it was always brief, a fraction of a second. But in those moments, I could see her face in perfect clarity, the delicate arch of her eyebrows, the faint shadow of a smile still caught at the corner of her mouth, the way her eyes seemed to reflect more than just the light they seemed to hold it. Each time, I caught myself thinking the same thing. I want to remember her like this forever. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the entire atmosphere of that moment, the way she sat with her hands curled loosely around her cup, her shoulders relaxed, her voice calm but rich with meaning. She seemed present in a way I rarely saw in people anymore. We had drifted far from our earlier conversations. Now our words wandered aimlessly, sometimes looping back to earlier topics, sometimes veering into quiet pauses that felt just as full as speech. She told me about the way she used to watch storms from her grandmother's porch, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder. I told her about a rainy afternoon years ago when I'd gotten lost in a city I didn't know and ended up finding the best bookstore I'd ever been in. Every now and then, I'd catch myself staring not at her directly, but at the small gestures, the subtle movements that seemed uniquely hers. The way she occasionally stirred her tea, even after the leaves had settled. The way she leaned slightly forward when she was interested in what I was saying. The way her eyes softened when she listened, as if she was giving my words more space than they deserved. The calf had begun to thin out. Chairs were pushed back, umbrellas were reopened, and damp coats brushed past us on their way to the door. The low buzz of conversation dwindled, but we stayed where we were, untouched by the quiet shift around us. Once, she caught me watching her during a flash of lightning. Instead of looking away quickly, I held her gaze for a second longer than was polite. Something passed between us in that glance, not a declaration, not a question, but an acknowledgement, a shared awareness that this was no longer just about passing the time until the rain stopped. Outside, the street lamps flickered to life, casting amber pools of light on the wet pavement. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of tea leaves and rain-soaked air. I felt as though we were suspended in a bubble, where the rules of time didn't apply, where leaving would feel like stepping out of a dream before it was ready to end. The rain had been the reason we were both here, but as the evening deepened, I realized something quietly certain. Even if the storm had passed hours ago, I wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else. The rain had been our constant companion all evening, but now it had softened into a faint drizzle, almost hesitant to leave. Through the calf windows, the street outside glistened under the mellow glow of the lamps, each puddle reflecting a piece of the night sky. The storm had passed, yet the air still carried the clean, sharp scent of wet earth and stone. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us touching our empty cups. There was a certain weight to the quiet, something fragile and unspoken that neither of us seemed willing to disturb. Then she glanced toward the window, her gaze lingering on the lamplight spilling across the street. "I should go," she said finally, her voice soft, almost reluctant. She rose from her seat with slow, deliberate movements, as though giving herself time to reconsider. Her hands reached for the scarf draped over the back of her chair, wrapping it loosely around her neck. I watched her without moving, feeling the warmth she had brought to the table begin to fade into the cool air between us. But then she looked at me, really looked, her eyes meeting mine in a way that seemed to ask for something, even if she didn't say it aloud. That was the moment I felt it, that quiet tug, that urge to keep her here just a little longer. I didn't want to let her walk away into the night, not when it felt like there was still more to say, more to discover, more to feel. "Maybe we could meet here again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, casual, as though it wasn't something I'd been thinking about since the moment she first sat at my table. For a heartbeat, she didn't answer. Her scarf was in place, her hand resting on the strap of her bag, but her eyes stayed locked on mine. Then slowly, her lips curved into that same warm, familiar smile that had disarmed me hours ago. "I'd like that," she said. The simplicity of her words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. She didn't say yes just to be polite. There was something deliberate in the way she said it, a promise wrapped in the softness of her voice. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and we walked together toward the door. The calf had emptied out, the last few patrons gathering their coats and heading into the night. The bell above the door chimed gently as we stepped outside, the cool air brushing against my face. The streets were quiet now, washed clean by the rain. The amber glow of the street lamp stretched across the slick pavement, broken only by the ripple of puddles underfoot. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a passing car faded into the stillness. We stood there for a moment side by side, neither of us making the first move to part ways. She glanced up at the night sky, the faint outline of clouds drifting apart to reveal a sliver of moonlight. "Thank you for the tea," she said softly, though I was certain it wasn't just the tea she was grateful for. "Thank you for sharing your table," I replied, knowing full well it was much more than a shared table. Her eyes met mine one last time, and I realized she was giving me something rare, an unspoken understanding that this wasn't the end of our story. We didn't need to define it yet. We both knew we'd see each other again. She gave a small nod, then turned and began to walk down the quiet street. I stood there for a few seconds longer, watching her, until the curve of the road took her out of sight. The rain had stopped, but the echo of it still lingered in the air and in me. I knew then that tonight wasn't just an evening in a cafe. It was the start of something I didn't yet have words for. She walked away into the damp night, her steps slow but steady, her scarf catching the faint glow of the street lamps. I stayed where I was, my hand resting on the doorframe of the cafe, watching until the curve of the road swallowed her silhouette. It was strange how in just a few hours, a stranger could feel like someone you'd known all along. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining, each puddle reflecting the faint light of the lamps above. The air was cool and clean, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and distant jasmine from a flower shop down the block. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark, just as she had. Inside, the cafe was quieter now. A few tables sat empty, chairs pushed neatly back into place, the faint clink of dishes echoing from behind the counter. My own cup still sat on the table where we'd talked for hours, the tea inside long gone cold. I glanced at it as I passed, feeling a strange fondness for something so ordinary, simply because it had been part of that moment. I stepped outside and began walking in the opposite direction from where she'd gone, but my thoughts refused to follow my feet. They lingered on her, on the way she listened, on the way her eyes lit up when something amused her, on the way her laughter felt like a thread weaving itself into the fabric of my memory. The night was quiet, except for the occasional drip of water from rooftops into puddles below. The sound reminded me of the rain's steady rhythm earlier, the way it had framed our conversation like background music chosen just for us. Even now, I can still see the moment clearly. She's sitting by the window with the rain behind her, a cup cradled between her hands. The way her smile had started small, as if it wasn't sure of itself, before settling into something warmer, more certain. The way her voice seemed to carry more than just words, it carried calm, like a soft tide pulling you closer without you realizing it. As I walked, I thought about the oddness of it all. If the rain hadn't started when it did, if the cafe hadn't been full, if the waiter hadn't asked us to share a table, none of this would have happened. Or maybe it would have. Maybe some moments are inevitable, waiting for us to step into them, no matter how many small details have to line up. When I reached my street, the lamplight pooled on the wet pavement like melted gold. I paused before heading inside, letting the night air cool the lingering heat in my cheeks. I tried to tell myself it was just a conversation, just a few hours in a cafe, but I knew better. It had been more than that, because she had left something behind, an echo that followed me even now, in the quiet of the night. Even now, every rainy evening brings her back to me. The moment the first drops begin to fall against the window, I'm back in that cafe. I can smell the tea, hear the soft hum of voices, feel the warmth of her across the table. I can see the way she tilted her head when she was curious, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her cup when she was thinking. It's strange how some memories don't fade with time, they only sharpen, like the details you notice in an old photograph. The longer you look at it, her smile is like that for me. No matter how much time passes, it's as warm as it was in that first moment, as if it's been preserved perfectly in the amber of my mind. Some moments in life happen quietly, without fanfare, but they stay, not because they were loud or grand, but because they were exactly what you didn't know you were waiting for. That rainy evening was one of those moments, and her smile was worth waiting a lifetime for.